He was not crawling through the grass. He stood upright, watching with purpose.
Not a snake, but a hybrid being, part angel, part beast, radiant and fallen. His voice was not a hiss, but a whisper.
He didn't offer fruit, he offered contact.
And that single moment, barely noticed, may have been the spark that tore paradise apart.
What if the fall of Eden was not about a forbidden fruit, but about a whisper spoken in the perfect stillness of paradise? Eve, pure and radiant, walked among the trees with the innocence of one who had never known deceit. Adam stood nearby, unaware that something ancient, beautiful and deliberate was watching. The creature was not a snake as we picture it. The ancient texts describe a being full of wisdom and beauty, standing, speaking, reasoning. He was called the serpent, but the word in Hebrew, nash, also implies whisperer, enchanter, a being who bends perception and shifts realities. This was not a crawling reptile. This was a hybrid being, radiant as a jewel, fallen from grace, driven by purpose. He did not roar or strike. He approached with patience. He used words crafted to slip through defenses. He saw Eve not with lust, but with intent. Not to harm her body, but to enter her perception. To question what she knew. To reframe the truth in subtle tones. She did not see danger. She saw brilliance. He didn't speak of rebellion. He spoke of possibility. And somewhere in that moment, between suggestion and trust, something irreversible began. Not through violence, but through design. What followed was not disobedience. It was a quiet transaction of perception. And the consequence was a shift that still echoes. Eve was not corrupted. She was opened. And the cost of that awakening was the peace of paradise. He stood at the edge of paradise. Not outside it, but within. He had been there before. He knew the frequencies. He knew the rules. He also knew how to break them without leaving a trace. The hybrid being called serpent in the old texts was not crawling. He was calculating. He waited. Not behind trees, but within possibilities. He studied Eve not with desire, but with design. The garden was beauty, and she was the crown of it. She was the breath of creation shaped in flesh. Her steps were light. Her soul was untouched. And that was what drew him. Untouched meant unguarded. She was not weak. She was whole, open, sacred, the perfect ground for suggestion. He didn't rush. He didn't tremble. His presence was calm. Almost holy. That is why she didn't fear. When he appeared, it was not as threat, but as a presence of knowledge. The ancient scriptures call him cunning. Not because of lies. Because of layers. He knew how to speak truth with angles. He began not with command, but with a question. Did God really say? He wasn't offering fruit. He was offering reframing. He did not tempt her with hunger. He awakened something else. Curiosity. Autonomia. Expansion. And it worked because he didn't challenge her faith. He expanded her vision. She was the garden, and he walked through her mind as he would through trees. His words moved like breeze, gentle but deliberate. No warning. No alarms. And that was his genius. No force. Only invitation. He invited her to consider. To taste not just fruit, but perspective. And when she looked at the tree again, it looked different. She had not changed. Her perception had. That is the real beginning of the fall. The moment where what was forbidden became desirable, not because of sin, but because of context. He did not change the rules. He changed the light by which she saw them. And with that, the fruit did not tempt her body. It resonated with her mind. It became aligned with potential. The act that followed was not rushed. It was considered. And when she reached out, she was not in rebellion. She was in response. Not to God, but to the whisper. The voice that had entered, not her ears, but her atmosphere. The serpent never needed to touch her. He altered the garden inside her. And so, when her hand moved, the fall had already begun. Not with a bite, but with the shift. That was the cascade. That was the rupture. That was the moment when paradise trembled, not with thunder, but with the silence of agreement. The creature moved with intention. Every word was placed like a stone across a river, meant to guide her step by step. Eve did not feel danger. She felt dialogue. She felt discovery. There was no fear, only fascination. He was not challenging her loyalty. He was awakening her power. And power, once glimpsed, is not easily forgotten. The hybrid being did not need to possess her. He needed her to possess the question. Why not? Why is this forbidden if it is beautiful? He did not raise his voice. He shaped her silence. He turned wonder into will. And in that moment, she no longer waited for answers. She began to form her own. The garden had rules, but now she saw them as barriers. The fruit did not call to her. The idea did. And the idea had a voice. His voice. The one that wrapped around her senses like morning mist. She walked past Adam, not because she hid, but because she was no longer only his reflection. She had encountered a new image. Not a divine one. A broken one, but beautiful. And when she brought the fruit to him, it was not an act of betrayal. It was communion. She was changed, and she invited him into that change. He did not question. He did not resist. And that silence was the final breach. Eden had not fallen yet. But now it had been shared. Knowledge had been eaten. Perception had been rewritten. And heaven paused. The creature had not destroyed paradise. He had inserted a virus. A whisper embedded in thought. Eve looked at Adam and saw agreement. But the air was different now. Lighter, yet heavier. The leaves rustled, not from wind, but from awareness. Nakedness had not changed their bodies. It had changed their understanding of being seen. The creature watched this. Not with victory, but with fulfillment. He had not broken Eve. He had bent her perception. And through that shift, he had touched what even God had left untouched. Her will. The garden was still there. The trees, the sky, the animals. But innocence had exited. And in its place came awareness. The serpent did not move again. His work was complete. He had entered the sacred. And what he planted was still echoing. Not in Eden. In us. What had begun as a whisper now lingered like a presence in the soil. The creature had not taken. He had invited. And that was the brilliance of his act. No force. No marks. No violence. Only transformation. He had spoken like a friend, like a guide, like a messenger of clarity. He offered no curse, no chaos, only clarity. But clarity misaligned is the most seductive deception. The garden was not broken by storms, but by a suggestion. He had made the divine seem restrictive, and the forbidden seem liberating. And in that inversion, the shift began. The creature watched Eve and Adam stand in silence, clothed only in realization. Not shame yet. That would come. First came knowing. The fruit had not burned their mouths. It had unlocked something unseen. Their eyes were open. But what they saw was themselves, not glory. They saw limitation, fragility, vulnerability. The serpent was gone, but his echo remained. A whisper that had turned into architecture within the human psyche. A structure built from altered perception. God had created a space of trust. The serpent had reshaped it into choice. Now they stood between those realities, unable to return, unsure how to move forward. And this is how the fall began. Not with rebellion, but with revision. Not with defiance, but with distortion. The garden, still lush, now bore a wound. Invisible to nature, but etched in consciousness. This was the true beginning of exile. Not when they left the garden, but when the garden left them. Its innocence, its clarity, its resonance was now veiled. And the creature? He had done what no being had ever done. He altered creation by whispering to its crown. He bent the will of the untouched. He redefined innocence as ignorance. And gave humanity its first taste of doubt. That was the power he carried. And that is why he was never just a serpent. He was the first deceiver. The first invader. The first shadow in a world of light. The hybrid intruder. The whisperer. Adam had not spoken. He had not guarded. The silence of man became the gate through which distortion walked. And Eve? She had not schemed. She had followed a voice. And the voice had led her to consider. Then to reach. Then to share. This is how the intruder did not enter Eden through force, but through consideration. He bypassed the gate by entering the mind. Even now, the legacy of that whisper lives on. It is in the pause before compromise. It is in the reshaping of language. The softening of what is clear. The redefinition of trust. And the hybrid being, clothed in ancient wisdom and twisted glory, remains the most mysterious figure of Genesis. A creature who did not bring war, but planted war. Not in the garden, but in the soul. This is why the text says the serpent was more cunning than any beast of the field. He was not just another creation. He was something else. Something ancient. Something other. And as Eve and Adam stood with altered eyes, with minds awakened not to divinity, but to division, the garden began to pull away. Not physically, but in frequency. The harmony fractured. The light dimmed. And paradise, once pulsing with divine rhythm, now held a strange silence. Not peace. Not presence. But pause. Something had changed. Something had been touched. Not just fruit. Not just thought. But the very order of innocence. And it all began with a whisper. The whisper of the intruder. The moment of contact did not happen with noise. It unfolded in stillness. Not even the trees moved. It was as if Eden itself was holding its breath. The hybrid being had spoken. The whisper had done its work. But now came the moment that would mark everything. Eve stood before the tree. She reached. But something more than her hand was involved. Her will, her perspective, her openness had already been shifted. The serpent had not forced her. He had reshaped the light around the choice. And in that light, what had once been danger now looked like destiny. She did not take the fruit from the tree. She took it from the idea. From the new lens he had offered. He had not given her something to eat. He had given her something to become. And when she took it, she didn't tremble. She was calm. It was not temptation. It was transformation. This is why the fall was not loud. It was intimate. Eve was not simply deceived. She was redefined. And what she carried from that moment was not just a fruit. It was a seed of change. A new awareness. She turned to Adam. Her eyes were the same. But her gaze carried weight. He did not ask. She did not explain. And when he took the fruit, he was not seduced. He surrendered. Not to her. To the shift. The hybrid creature had done what no war could do. He had altered the order by changing perception. This was not about appetite. This was about identity. Eve had not eaten alone. She had been entered. Not physically. But symbolically. The whisper had entered her perception, her decision, her spirit. And what happens in spirit always reaches the flesh. That is the mystery. That is the fall. The serpent did not need to touch her body. He had already touched her reality. And when Adam bit into that fruit, he was not just disobeying. He was aligning. He was joining her in the rupture. The serpent stood back. He did not gloat. He had no need. His work was done. Not in the fruit. In the shift. The sound of paradise changed. Something had been torn. It had no name. But it had presence. The Creator came walking. Not with anger. With question. Where are you? Not because he did not know. But because they no longer did. That was the consequence. Not exile. Not death. Disorientation. Disconnection. The serpent had inserted a fog. A spiritual distortion. Eve had crossed a line without knowing. Adam had followed without seeing. And the creature? He remained unnamed, but unforgettable. He had not taken power. He had shifted it. This was not rebellion. It was a recalibration of awareness. And the garden would never feel the same again. When Eve first heard the whisper, she did not think she was entering a covenant. She thought she was listening. But listening is the doorway. It is the access point. The serpent was not selling rebellion. He was offering revelation. But his revelation came twisted. Not by lies, but by order. He restructured truth like a melody in a different key. And it sounded beautiful. It sounded freeing. But it was foreign to the song of the garden. Adam had received the instruction directly. But Eve had not. She had heard it second-hand. And the serpent knew this. He found the gap. And in that gap, he whispered. She did not fall by pride. She fell by persuasion. And persuasion is a slow storm. It gathers in thoughts. It pours through tone. And it floods judgment quietly. By the time the fruit was in her hand, the fall was already underway. Not in her action, but in her frame. She was still beautiful. Still divine. But altered. The serpent never needed to possess her. He needed her to carry what he said. And that is exactly what she did. She became the first carrier of distortion. Not because she intended to, but because she listened. And what she carried, she offered. Not with manipulation. But with love. That is the tragedy. The fall came not with hatred, but with union. They fell together. They awoke together. And they hid together. The first couple, now aware, now vulnerable, now veiled. The garden had not changed. They had. And in that change, Eden was no longer a home. It was a witness. It had seen the whisper enter, and it would now feel the consequence. The serpent? He did not remain. His work had never been about staying. It was about seeding. And what he seeded was not just confusion. It was inheritance. That is why the story matters even now. Because the whisper did not end in the garden. It entered the bloodline. It marked the soul. The first child born after Eden would carry the echo of that touch. And he would kill. Not by accident, but by consequence. The serpent did not just corrupt a choice. He disturbed a future. The hybrid being, once guardian, now intruder, was not just a figure of the past. He became a pattern. And that pattern continues. In lies that sound like truth. In beauty that carries distortion. In whispers that challenge identity. The fall was not a moment. It was the beginning of momentum. The serpent had not introduced evil. He had introduced question. That was enough. He did not break trust with violence. He diluted it with alternatives. And trust diluted is trust dissolved. Eve still believed in God. But now she also believed in herself. Not as reflection, but as origin. And Adam, following her lead, embraced a reality untested. That was the weight of the touch. It touched not their skin, but their roles. It reversed the flow. The voice of the Creator once led. Now it echoed behind uncertainty. Their ears were open, but full of echoes. Their eyes were open, but blurred by new filters. The serpent had stepped back, but his architecture remained. He had restructured the garden from within its own inhabitants. And when God walked among the trees, they hid. Not because he had changed, but because they had. They felt exposed. But there were no crowds. They felt watched. But no one else was there. That is the power of the fall. It births fear in the presence of perfect love. God called to them. They answered with distance. That was new. That was unnatural. Before, they had walked with him. Now they stepped away. And he knew. Not just what they did, but what they had become. Altered. Misaligned. The creature's whisper had done what no force could do. It had separated man from his source. And though the fruit still hung on the tree, the dissonance had already taken root. Their coverings were not shame in fabric. They were shame in form. They now saw themselves as objects. As naked. As wrong. And shame changes posture. It bends what once stood. It covers what once was free. That was the inheritance. And it had begun not with defiance, but with a whisper. A whisper that still echoes today. And though their bodies remained intact, something in their essence had shifted. The balance between creation and creator had tilted. The serpent had not destroyed harmony. He had redirected it. And that redirection would ripple forward, not only in Eden, but through generations. The serpent did not linger. He did not boast. That was not his way. His silence after the act was louder than any declaration. He knew what had been done. He had seeded a legacy. Not of violence, but of questioning. Of autonomy untethered from origin. The serpent had never asked for worship. Only consideration. And in giving that, humanity altered its foundation. This is why the creature matters. Not as myth, but as mirror. Because in every generation, the whisper returns. It takes new forms, new voices, new masks. But its intention is unchanged. Not to consume, but to convince. And it began here. With a whisper that touched the crown of creation, and turned side inward. From the heavens to the self. And in that gaze, paradise fell. The garden remained lush. But the innocence that had once crowned it was gone. God's voice, once familiar, now stirred fear. The shift had occurred. The serpent had not destroyed Eden with force. He had wounded it through consciousness. And now, that consciousness carried weight. Shame clothed what had once been freedom. The Creator asked questions not to gain knowledge, but to expose fracture. Who told you that you were naked? Had they eaten? Had they listened to another voice? And they had. Not a stranger's voice. A familiar one. The voice of beauty misused. Of wisdom corrupted. The voice of the whisperer. The hybrid being, now vanished, had altered their position. No longer did they walk in harmony. Now they stepped back. Their view of themselves had changed. Their view of him had dimmed. And from that dimming came judgment, not vengeance. Consequence. The serpent was not cursed alone. The ground was altered. The woman would carry pain. The man would carry labor. But the serpent's consequence was the most telling. Cursed are you above all beasts. From upright to crawling. From brilliance to dust. From proximity to exile. And the most cryptic declaration of all, your seed will be at war with her seed. He shall crush your head, and you shall bruise his heel. A prophecy. A fracture sealed in flesh. From now on, the human lineage would carry the echo of that contact. Eve would give birth. But not in purity. In struggle. She had not only tasted knowledge. She had embodied it. And that knowledge bore fruit. Cain and Abel. One carried chaos. The other carried innocence. The serpent's work did not end with Eve. It unfolded in lineage, in choices. And every time deception whispered, the garden's shadow lengthened. Adam and Eve left Eden. Not thrown. Separated. Not only by judgment, but by nature. They were no longer attuned to the rhythm of the garden. Their frequency had changed. And the serpent? He remained in the background. Not gone. Just hidden. He would appear again, in forms and stories, through kings, through systems, through thought. But Eden would always be his first stage. His first victory. Not over God, but over perception. Over trust. Over clarity. The tree was never about hunger. It was about boundaries. The serpent crossed it with a question. Eve crossed it with a thought. Adam with agreement. And so the fracture remains. Not visible. But embedded. In memory. In instinct. In story. In longing for something we can't quite name. And that longing is not just for Eden. It is for before the whisper. The serpent's influence did not end with exile. It evolved. It adjusted. What began as a whisper in Eden turned into systems of confusion. Into cycles of rebellion. Into questions that continue to echo through generations. The children of Adam and Eve did not grow up in paradise. They grew up in aftermath. And the soil beneath their feet remembered the sound of the fall. Cain was born first. His name means acquired. And in him, the consequence was embodied. He did not rebel against God. He rebelled against comparison. And when his sacrifice was not received, the old whisper stirred again. Not externally. Internally. He heard the voice of anger. Of entitlement. Of revenge. And he spilled the blood of his brother. The serpent had not spoken. But the distortion had multiplied. It was not a new whisper. It was the same seed, watered by disappointment. The serpent's legacy was not loud. It was generational. It was a scar passed invisibly from breath to breath. From womb to womb. And this is how humanity inherited not just sin, but shadow. We did not only lose Eden. We lost clarity. Identity. Alignment. The garden became a memory. And memories distort. But deep within the human soul, a trace of the garden remains. A longing for what was. A hunger for innocence untouched. That hunger fuels myths, religions, philosophies. We are all trying to remember. And in that remembering, the serpent still lurks. Not outside. But beneath the surface. He is the whisper beneath ambition. The doubt beneath devotion. The shift in the lens that makes wrong look like wisdom. And the most terrifying truth is this. The serpent never left. He was never bound to Eden. He was bound to influence. And influence travels through story. Through instinct. Through culture. Through wounds. Every time a truth is twisted into flattery, the serpent speaks. Every time innocence is traded for relevance, the whisper grows louder. And yet, the promise remains. Her seed would one day crush his head. There would come one untouched. One who could see clearly. Who would not be seduced. Until then, humanity walks between the trees of memory and longing. Not back to Eden. But forward to redemption. And in the in-between, the whisper remains. We are not just fallen. We are fractured. And the hybrid being who triggered it all waits. Not for worship. Not for return. But for repetition. Because his victory was never Eden. It was perception. And that is why this story must be told. Again and again. Not as myth. But as warning. We do not simply descend from Adam and Eve. We descend from the moment of distortion. And that moment was intimate. Beautiful. Devastating. It wasn't just a story of failure. It was the story of human sensitivity, misguided by something more ancient than we can comprehend. That creature, part glory, part ruin, knew how to approach. How to enter. He was not only in the garden. He was in the pause between clarity and confusion. He became the shadow that lingers when trust is questioned. And perhaps that is the true loss. Not Eden. Not immortality. But clarity. Now we live in fragments. We search for meaning through filters. We reinterpret God through wounds. And every time the whisper reemerges, it disguises itself as enlightenment. As empowerment. As freedom. But at its core, it remains what it was. A seed of severance. The serpent was never a beast of the field. He was a mirror of ambition. A being with memory of glory and thirst for disruption. His touch was not on skin. It was on history. On lineage. He touched perception. And perception became narrative. That narrative still shapes humanity. From Cain to kings. From temples to ideologies. From innocence to strategy. And the creature? He still whispers. Not from trees. From screens. From pulpits. From policies. The echo of his first entrance is still vibrating. In wars. In shame. In self-idolatry. He is not gone. He has evolved. No longer a voice in a garden. A system in the world. And this is why we remember. Why we speak. Why we warn. Because the serpent was not a symbol. He was a presence. And that presence still calls. Not to your body. To your agreement. And when we agree with distortion, we invite exile. Not from a place. From peace. From purpose. From clarity. And yet, within this weight lies a promise. That what was lost can be restored. That what was fractured can be healed. But only when we see the serpent for what he was. Not a snake. Not a metaphor. But the first shadow. The original whisper. The intruder who changed everything with a look, a word, a seed. The whisper that brought down paradise was not loud. It was elegant. Precise. And its echo still moves in us, not just as myth, but as memory. We were not only banished from Eden. We inherited its fracture. And in every generation, that hybrid being reappears. Not with claws, but with influence. Not to steal. But to reshape. That is why remembering matters. That is why we tell this story. Because awareness is the beginning of resistance. Clarity is the first defense. And if this touched something in you, if the